The AR-15 was pointed directly at my pregnant wife's stomach when I walked out of our garage that Tuesday morning. Linda Carver, our HOA president, stood on our driveway in her perfectly pressed pink blazer, finger on the trigger guard, screaming about our grass being half an inch too tall. Before you watch full story, comment down from which country are you watching. Don't forget to subscribe. I warned you people about property compliance. Linda shrieked, the weapon steady in her manicured hands. This neighborhood has standards. My wife Jessica stood frozen by our mailbox, her hand protectively covering her 7-month belly, tears streaming down her face. She'd only walked outside to get the mail. Time slowed to a crawl. My construction worker instincts kicked in, assess the threat, protect what matters most, act fast. But nothing in 20 years of job sites had prepared me for a suburban soccer mom holding a semi-automatic rifle on my pregnant wife over lawn maintenance. Linda, put the gun down, I said, raising my hands slowly. Let's talk about this like adults. Adults follow HOA regulations, she screamed, swinging the barrel toward me. Adults don't let their property values destroy the entire neighborhood. The irony would have been funny if my wife wasn't in the crosshairs. Our grass was maybe half an inch taller than regulation because Jessica had been on bed rest for 2 weeks. Doctor's orders. But apparently, medical emergencies didn't override Linda Carver's interpretation of community standards. This wasn't Linda's first power trip, but it was definitely her most dangerous. For the past 8 months, Linda had been escalating her harassment of families who didn't bow to her every demand. It started with passive-aggressive notes about trash can placement. Then came the fines for children's chalk drawings on sidewalks. Last month, she'd called Child Protective Services on the Martinez family because their kids were unsupervised, while playing in their own backyard. But today, Linda had crossed a line that would destroy her perfect suburban kingdom forever. Jessica, I called softly to my wife, slowly walked toward the house. Don't you dare move. Linda screamed, retargeting the rifle at Jessica's midsection. Nobody moves until this violation is addressed. That's when I realized Linda wasn't just having a breakdown. She was completely detached from reality. The woman who'd organized bake sales and holiday decorating contests had become something genuinely dangerous. My phone was in my back pocket. One wrong move and she'd panic. But I couldn't let this continue with my wife and unborn child in immediate danger. Linda, you're scaring Jessica, I said, trying to keep my voice calm. She's pregnant. This stress isn't good for the baby. Maybe you should have thought about that before violating community standards, Linda replied, her voice taking on an eerie calm that was somehow more terrifying than her screaming. Actions have consequences in my neighborhood. Her neighborhood. That phrase told me everything I needed to know about Linda's mental state. Your neighborhood? I asked, slowly reaching for my phone. Linda, you're an HOA president, not a dictator. You don't own this place. I maintain property values, she snapped. I protect investments. I enforce standards that keep this community desirable. The rifle barrel never wavered from Jessica's direction. That's when I made the call that would end Linda Carver's reign of terror forever. 911 dispatch answered on the first ring. 911, what's your emergency? Armed woman with rifle threatening my pregnant wife, I said clearly. Willowbrook Estates, 847 Maple Street. Suspect is Linda Carver, HOA president. She's holding an AR-15 on my wife over a lawn violation. Linda's eyes went wide when she heard me identify her by name. For the first time since I'd walked outside, the rifle barrel dropped slightly. Sir, are you in immediate danger? The dispatcher asked. Yes. My wife is 7 months pregnant and the suspect has the weapon trained on her. This started as an HOA dispute about grass height. Even as I said it, I realized how insane it sounded. But that was Linda's world. A place where minor infractions justified life-threatening responses. Units are en route, the dispatcher said. Stay on the line. Try to keep the suspect calm. But Linda was anything but calm. The realization that I'd called police on her seemed to trigger a complete psychological break. You called the police on me? She said, her voice rising to a shriek. I'm protecting this neighborhood. I'm maintaining standards. You're destroying property values with your negligence. She raised the rifle again and I watched my wife flinch backward against our mailbox. Linda, think about what you're doing, I said desperately. You have grandchildren. You run the neighborhood book club. This isn't you. This is exactly me, she screamed. This is what leadership looks like. Someone has to enforce the rules when people like you think they're above community standards. The sound of approaching sirens seemed to snap something in Linda's brain. Instead of surrendering, she became more agitated, pacing back and forth while keeping the weapon pointed in Jessica's general direction. "They're not taking me," she muttered. "I've done nothing wrong. I'm protecting property values. I'm maintaining standards." The first police car arrived with lights flashing but no siren, followed immediately by 2 more units. Officers positioned themselves behind their vehicles, weapons drawn, shouting commands that Linda either couldn't hear or was choosing to ignore. "Drop the weapon. Drop it now. Ma'am, put the gun down and step away from the civilians." But Linda seemed to exist in her own reality where she was the victim of some grand conspiracy against proper neighborhood management. "I'm not the criminal here," she shouted toward the police. "These people are destroying our community with their negligence. Look at their grass. Look at their mailbox placement. This is what happens when standards aren't enforced." The absurdity of the situation was lost on Linda, but not on the officers. I could see them exchanging glances that said they were dealing with someone completely divorced from rational thought. Jessica was still frozen by the mailbox, one hand on her belly, tears streaming down her face. I could see her lips moving in what looked like prayer. "Linda," I tried again, "please think about Jessica's baby. You're putting an innocent child at risk. Children need proper neighborhoods." Linda replied as if that somehow justified threatening an unborn baby with a rifle. "Children need property values. Children need standards." That's when Officer Martinez, who I recognized from neighborhood community meetings, tried a different approach. "Mrs. Carver," he called out, "it's Officer Martinez. We've met at the school safety presentations. Can you help me understand what's happening here?" Linda's head snapped toward the familiar voice. For a moment, her expression softened slightly. "Officer Martinez," she said, "these people are destroying our neighborhood. I've tried following proper procedures, but they refuse to comply with basic standards." "What standards are we talking about, Mrs. Carver?" "Grass height, mailbox alignment, property maintenance. I've sent them 3 notices about violations, and they've ignored every single one." The negotiation continued for another 10 minutes while Jessica remained frozen in Linda's line of fire. I watched my wife's face grow paler as the stress took its toll, and I realized this standoff needed to end before it hurt our baby. "Officer Martinez," I called out, "my wife needs medical attention. She's been on bed rest and this stress could cause complications." Linda's response was swift and terrifying. "Medical attention?" she screamed. "What about my medical attention? What about the stress you've caused me with your constant violations? What about my property value anxiety?" She was comparing pregnancy complications to property value anxiety while holding a rifle on my wife. That's when I knew Linda Carver was completely beyond reason. The SWAT team arrived 20 minutes into the standoff, their presence finally seeming to penetrate Linda's delusion. Suddenly faced with armored officers and professional crisis negotiators, she began to understand the magnitude of what she'd done. "This is all wrong," she said, her voice becoming smaller and more confused. "I was just enforcing the rules. I was protecting the neighborhood." "Mrs. Carver," the SWAT negotiator said through a megaphone, "nobody wants to hurt you. But you need to put the weapon down so we can talk." "But the grass," Linda said weakly, "their grass is too tall." Even the negotiator seemed stunned by the complete disconnect between Linda's actions and her stated motivation. "Ma'am, grass height violations don't require weapons. Let's put the gun down and discuss the proper procedures for handling HOA concerns." For the first time in 45 minutes, Linda looked directly at Jessica and seemed to actually see what she was doing. My wife stood there, pregnant and terrified, tears streaming down her face, one hand protective over her belly. "Oh my God," Linda whispered, finally seeing herself through normal human eyes. "What have I done?" The rifle clattered to the driveway as Linda collapsed to her knees, sobbing. The officers moved in immediately, securing the weapon and placing Linda in handcuffs while paramedics rushed to check on Jessica. "Ma'am, are you injured?" the paramedic asked Jessica. "Any cramping? Bleeding? Chest pain?" "Just scared," Jessica managed to say, her voice shaking. "Is the baby okay?" The paramedic checked Jessica's vitals and listened to the baby's heartbeat. "Everything sounds normal, but we should get you to the hospital for monitoring. This kind of stress can sometimes trigger early labor." As Jessica was helped into the ambulance, I watched Linda being loaded into a police car. The woman who'd terrorized our neighborhood for months looked small and broken, finally understanding the consequences of her actions. But this was just the beginning of Linda Carver's fall from suburban power. The charges came fast and severe: assault with a deadly weapon, terroristic threatening, reckless endangerment, and brandishing a firearm. Since Jessica was pregnant, several charges were enhanced under laws protecting unborn children. The bond hearing was a circus. Linda's lawyer tried to argue that she was having a mental health crisis, but the prosecutor painted a picture of systematic escalation and abuse of authority that had been building for months. "Your Honor," District Attorney Williams said, "Mrs. Carver has been terrorizing this neighborhood for months. She's filed false police reports, made threats against families, and has shown a pattern of using her HOA position to harass residents who don't submit to her demands. This incident with the AR-15 represents the culmination of months of escalating abuse." The judge set bond at $250,000, noting that Linda posed a clear danger to the community. But the legal consequences were just the beginning of Linda's punishment. The HOA board held an emergency meeting that evening and voted unanimously to remove Linda from her position and ban her from all future HOA activities. The vote wasn't even close. It was 8-0 with Linda's closest ally, Margaret Foster, abstaining rather than defending her. "Linda Carver's actions today have brought shame and legal liability to our entire community," board member James Patterson said during the meeting. "Her behavior has been unacceptable for months, and today's incident with a weapon crosses every possible line." The meeting was packed with residents who'd suffered under Linda's regime. Family after family stood up to share stories of harassment, intimidation, and abuse that had been building for months. The Martinez family described how Linda had called CPS on them for letting their children play unsupervised in their own backyard. The Thompson family talked about Linda's midnight inspections, where she'd shine flashlights into their windows looking for violations. The elderly Hendersons shared how Linda had tried to force them to remove their late son's memorial garden because it violated landscaping uniformity standards. "I've lived in this neighborhood for 30 years, Mrs. Henderson said, her voice shaking with emotion. "Linda Carver turned our community into a police state. She made people afraid to live in their own homes." But perhaps the most damaging testimony came from Linda's own former ally, Margaret Foster. "I supported Linda for months because I believed she cared about property values," Margaret said. "But over time I realized she didn't care about the community at all. She just enjoyed having power over people. She kept detailed files on every family, looking for things to use against them if they opposed her." The files Margaret mentioned would later become crucial evidence in Linda's prosecution. Police discovered that Linda had been conducting illegal surveillance on neighborhood families, taking photographs of their properties, documenting their daily routines, and even researching their employment and financial information to use as leverage in disputes. "My family's file was particularly extensive. Linda had documented Jessica's pregnancy, my work schedule, our visitors, and even our grocery shopping patterns. She'd been planning escalated harassment for weeks, waiting for the right moment to assert her authority. The rifle incident hadn't been a spontaneous breakdown. It had been a calculated intimidation tactic that went too far. The neighborhood's response was swift and decisive. Within a week of Linda's arrest, a petition began circulating to remove the entire HOA board and implement new bylaws that would prevent future abuse of power. "Linda Carver couldn't have operated like this without enablers," said petition organizer Tom Rodriguez. "The whole system that allowed her to terrorize families needs to be dismantled and rebuilt with proper oversight." The petition gathered 127 signatures in 3 days, more than enough to trigger a complete board recall election. But Linda's legal problems were just beginning. The FBI became interested in Linda's case when investigators discovered that she'd been using her HOA position to conduct background checks and surveillance activities that violated federal privacy laws. Her files on neighborhood families contained information that could only have been obtained through illegal means. Mrs. Carver was essentially running a private intelligence operation against American citizens, FBI agent Sarah Chin explained during a press conference. She obtained credit reports, employment records, and personal information through false pretenses and used that information to harass and intimidate families. The federal charges added another layer to Linda's legal nightmare: identity theft, wire fraud, and violations of the Fair Credit Reporting Act. Each charge carried potential prison time that would extend her sentence by years. But perhaps the most satisfying consequence came from an unexpected source: Linda's own homeowner's insurance company. Due to Mrs. Carver's criminal use of firearms on the insured property, coverage is terminated effective immediately, the letter from Mutual Assurance read. Additionally, claims related to this incident or subsequent legal actions are specifically excluded from coverage. Linda was facing hundreds of thousands of dollars in legal bills with no insurance protection and mounting criminal charges that could send her to prison for decades. The community impact extended far beyond Linda's personal consequences. Local news stations picked up the story, and Linda became the face of HOA abuse nationwide. Rifle-wielding HOA president threatens pregnant woman over grass height became a viral story that sparked national conversations about the need for HOA reform. Property values in Willowbrook estates, which Linda had claimed to protect, initially dropped as potential buyers were scared away by the negative publicity. But within 6 months, they rebounded higher than ever as the community gained a reputation for standing up to abuse and implementing transparent governance. The new HOA board, elected in a landslide vote for reform candidates, implemented bylaws that limited presidential power, required board approval for all enforcement actions, and established resident appeal processes for violations. Linda Carver's reign of terror taught us that unchecked power corrupts even at the neighborhood level, said newly elected HOA President Maria Santos. We're implementing safeguards to ensure no future president can weaponize their position against residents. The psychological evaluation ordered by Linda's defense team revealed the extent of her delusion. Dr. Patricia Kim's report described Linda as suffering from narcissistic personality disorder with paranoid features, combined with an obsessive need for control that had escalated into dangerous behavior. Mrs. Carver genuinely believed that her authority as HOA president gave her police-like powers over residents, Dr. Kim wrote. She viewed any resistance to her demands as personal attacks that justified escalated responses, including the threat of violence. The evaluation recommended extensive psychological treatment, but also noted that Linda showed little insight into the inappropriateness of her actions. Even during evaluation sessions, Mrs. Carver continued to justify her behavior by citing property value concerns and neighborhood standards, Dr. Kim noted. She appears to believe that her good intentions excuse her criminal actions. The trial, when it finally came 6 months later, was a showcase of Linda's complete disconnection from reality. Taking the stand in her own defense, Linda spent 3 hours explaining her property value theories and neighborhood management philosophy while completely avoiding any acknowledgement that pointing a rifle at a pregnant woman might be wrong. I was protecting investments, Linda testified. These people paid good money for homes in a quality neighborhood. If I don't enforce standards, property values collapse and everyone loses their investment. When the prosecutor asked if property values justified threatening someone's life, Linda's answer stunned the courtroom. I never threatened anyone's life, she said confidently. I was simply demonstrating the seriousness of the situation. Sometimes people need to understand that their actions have consequences. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. Guilty on all counts. The sentencing hearing was packed with Willowbrook residents who'd come to see Linda finally face consequences for months of harassment and intimidation. Mrs. Carver, your actions represent a fundamental misunderstanding of authority and responsibility, Judge Harrison said. You terrorized an entire neighborhood under the guise of property management. You threatened the life of a pregnant woman over grass height. Your complete lack of remorse demonstrates that you remain a danger to any community you might join. The sentence was severe but fair. 8 years in state prison for the weapons charges, plus 3 years federal time for the privacy violations, to be served consecutively. Linda would be nearly 60 years old before she was eligible for parole. But perhaps the most fitting consequence was the judge's additional order. Linda was permanently banned from serving in any HOA capacity anywhere in the state, and she was required to undergo psychological treatment for the duration of her sentence. You will never again have the opportunity to abuse a position of authority over your neighbors, Judge Harrison concluded. As Linda was led away in handcuffs, I thought about how one woman's need for control had destroyed so many lives, including her own. Jessica and I welcomed our daughter Emma 3 weeks after Linda's sentencing. Emma Carver Chin. We gave her Linda's last name as her middle name, not to honor our former tormentor, but to remind ourselves that even in the darkest situations, something beautiful can emerge. Why did you choose that name? Friends would ask. Because Linda Carver taught us that we're stronger than we knew, Jessica would answer. She tried to break our family, but instead she showed us how to fight for each other. The neighborhood Linda had tried to control with fear and intimidation became stronger and more united than ever. The shared trauma of her reign created bonds between families that might never have connected otherwise. The Martinez family became our closest friends. The Hendersons adopted us as surrogate grandparents for Emma. Tom Rodriguez and his family started a neighborhood watch program focused on supporting families rather than harassing them. Linda wanted to create a perfect neighborhood by force, Maria Santos observed during the first anniversary of Linda's arrest. Instead, she taught us how to create a perfect neighborhood through kindness and mutual support. The Willowbrook Estates HOA became a model for reform organizations nationwide. Our new bylaws and oversight procedures were copied by dozens of other communities dealing with abusive leadership. But perhaps the most meaningful outcome was personal. Jessica's pregnancy complications from the stress of Linda's threats required extended monitoring, bringing us closer together as we faced the possibility of losing our child. Emma's safe arrival felt like a victory not just over Linda's intimidation, but over the fear that had nearly robbed us of our joy. Every time I look at Emma, I remember that we didn't let Linda win, Jessica told me one evening as we watched our daughter sleep peacefully in her crib. She tried to steal our happiness and we chose to protect it instead. 3 years later, we still live in Willowbrook Estates. Our grass is exactly regulation height, not because we're afraid of HOA violations, but because we've learned to take pride in our home without being controlled by fear. Linda Carver is serving her sentence at Riverside Correctional Facility, where she reportedly continues to file complaints about institutional policies and procedures. According to her former lawyer, she still doesn't understand why pointing a rifle at a pregnant woman over grass height was inappropriate. Some people never learn. But our neighborhood did learn. We learned that standing up to bullies, even dangerous ones, is the only way to stop their abuse. We learned that communities are stronger when they're built on mutual support rather than fear. And we learned that sometimes the worst experiences in our lives can teach us the most important lessons about what really matters. Emma Carver Chin is now 3 years old, healthy and happy, growing up in a neighborhood where children can play safely and families can live without fear of arbitrary harassment from power-hungry neighbors. And that's the best revenge against Linda Carver's legacy of fear. A community full of families who refuse to be intimidated, children who play freely, and neighbors who support each other instead of looking for violations to report. Linda wanted to create a perfect neighborhood through control and intimidation. Instead, she taught us how to create a perfect neighborhood through courage and community. Sometimes the most dangerous bullies are the ones who think they're protecting us. But they're also the ones who teach us the most about our own strength when we finally decide to fight back. The AR-15 that Linda pointed at my pregnant wife was meant to be the ultimate symbol of her authority over our neighborhood. Instead, it became the weapon that destroyed her power forever and gave our community the courage to build something better. That's the thing about bullies, they always underestimate the people they're trying to control. Linda Carver thought a weapon would make us submit to her authority. Instead, it revealed her desperation and gave us the clarity to see that we'd been afraid of someone who was actually much weaker than us. The most powerful lesson from Linda's downfall isn't about HOAs or neighborhood disputes. It's about recognizing when someone's demand for control has become dangerous, and having the courage to call for help before that danger destroys innocent lives. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is make one phone call to 911. Sometimes that call saves not just your family but your entire community.